Hi class, welcome to the unit on slavery before the Civil War. Certainly a major topic in American history. These days, in the 2020s, we have in the public sphere uh, competing ideas about slavery in the American past, what it means, what was it, how relevant is it to our world today. Of course, the 1619 Project and June 19th is a potential holiday uh, feed into this. If you haven't participated in the 1619 Project or seen it, and then compared or contrasted it to the Trump presidency's 1776 Project, you'll get various versions of the American past. And of course, varieties of people on different political sides and other issues claiming the history is being manipulated. So, in this college level class, what you'll see we will go through is a fairly frank and blunt and evidence based version of what was going on. And then you, as the students of history, are able to um, figure out for yourselves, based on facts and evidence, what was going on and how important or not it is to American history. All right. So 1800, it's mostly 1820 to 1860, but we go back to 1800 because of the important developments of cotton that direction. So there are a lot of myths of slaveholding that we're going to kind of take on first, and then we're going to use raw numbers about what was going on, so you have a good picture. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had in airports or cruise ships or somewhere where someone is wanting to, when they find out what I do, discuss American history, and when the subject comes to slavery, uh, often but not always about modern race relations in the United States of America, I will get the ultimate mansplainer. I know I'm a man. I'm kind of a mansplainer, professor splainer myself because that's what I do for a living, but I'm aware of it, so I can reduce that. But they will do the well, actually, back in during slavery, and then they'll rattle off a version of what they know. And depending on the conversation, I will guide us towards the evidence or not. And so, as long as you have the evidence and then you're making an argument, then arguments can be different but well evidenced. And that's not a problem in history. It's when you're making errors about the basic issues of the past that makes it harder. So, this unit should help you understand slavery before the Civil War and not make those errors. Long introduction, but I think it's one of the more important topics in American history. It's not the only important one, but it is one very important one. Okay, myths. And by the way, a lot of abolitionists had some of these myths, just But basically, where do modern Americans get their images and understanding of slavery? Mostly from movies. Uh, by the way, the more recent movies have been a little better, a little more accurate. But if you don't even know what's going on wrongly in the past, then you wouldn't notice. Anyway, slaves lived on big estates. Well, that's going to be true for some, but not all. There were dozens of slaves on each plantation. That will be true for many, but not for all. The slaves produced cotton. That will be true for many, but not for all. The South was racist, but not the North. You've probably noticed in this class that's not very accurate. And again, it uses terms like the South and the North as if there isn't a broad racial complexion, right? Were black Southerners racist? Well, they could be or could not be, but when I said the South, that's not maybe who came to mind. When I said the North, did you think of African Americans in Philadelphia, who you've read about now? Or did you think of white folk, right? So the point is we need to be careful of sweeping generalizations, and this U.S. history class is supposed to start helping you see the variety of peoples who live in America in the past all over the place. Here's one that the abolitionists had that is a myth. Slavery was archaic and doomed to die out eventually. That was their argument, was it was backwards. as if I most students are anti-slavery in the present, and so I say this with that in mind. It will probably be scary to most of you who don't want slavery, if not all of you, that it was not archaic and it was not dying out. It was actually gaining traction, and there are suggestions that it was beginning to transition towards industrialism. So if you can imagine an industrialist South to some extent making factories based on slave production, that was starting to happen. It was a small portion, but it was starting. So, and then if and this is what I commonly do, and again, it's not to out, you know, fox my whoever I'm conversing with, but I want them to realize that in order to have a conversation on pre-Civil War slavery, we need to have some basic common understandings about the basics, and that they usually don't have that. That's not the point is to show they don't have it, but I'm bringing us to a place where we're all in agreement with the basic facts are. So, and you'll have this here in a minute. How many white Southerners owned slaves? For those who did, how many slaves did they own? What was the average slave holder? How many slaves did they have? Where did the average slave operate? What was their life like? What were the violence used? What was coercion? What was their daily life? What's African American culture? What's African American resistance? Slave resistance, African American slave resistance. Yeah, once you have these basic bases down and the basic information, then you can have meaningful conversations that are more rooted in the historical evidence. All right. So if these are the myths, let's kind of look what's going on. Well, after 1800 and towards 1860 to the Civil War in 1861 alters this. The pre-war South was very vibrant economically. It really was. It was growing at a significant rate. And a lot of this in this time period is due to the development of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. And there he is. And this led for new areas to be opened up to slave plantation based agriculture to produce cotton. So black and white populations move west from the Atlantic coast into what you will see is referred to by historians as the Cotton Belt or the Black Belt. So prolific is this production that cotton becomes, by 1860, actually even before then, over 50% of American exports, and it is produced by slaves. So that's one thing to note, is that as far as the export-import economy goes, exports, slave-produced product, just one, cotton, was already over 50% of the exports. So the economy is vibrant. It is based on slavery, even though there are non-slave holding production units as well. And they do produce cotton, tobacco, rice. You remember tobacco and rice from the colonial period, and some sugar in Louisiana, hemp for ropes, not for marijuana, or not for smoking. But let's not forget we have a great deal of domestics, slaves who are providing labors for households, urban and rural. And as I suggested, a few had started to move towards operating in factories. All right, so that's the overall where we're headed, that it is a very productive, growing, economically productive, and economically growing event. So, all right, time to absorb and digest a lot of statistics. First of all, you don't have to memorize most of these graphs, in that you don't need to know every single detail on it. But here you can see from 1790 to 1860, the growth of the production of cotton measured by bales, and the number of slaves grows very briskly, so that I don't need you to memorize 3.8 million bales of cotton, but I will have you know on the next slide the percentages of exports. But I do believe that it's good to know that from 1790 to 1860, the growth of slaves themselves is is very pronounced, and there is very little slave importation during this time period. There is up until 1808 legally, and there's a little bit of illegal importation of slaves after 1808, but very few compared to these numbers. So the main number from this, 4 million. If anyone were to ask you how many slaves were in the United States of America in 1860, we round up the number 4 million. And that is, in the South, a significant portion of the population. It had, for the United States population, by the way, African Americans had made up about 1 in 5 of its population at the time of independence in the Constitution. It's gone a little down from there because of migration from 1800 to 1860, and the North has started to lower it. But if we look at just the South, black folk, African Americans who are free or slave, represent a very significant portion of the population. All right, 4 million slaves. Now, looking at those bales of cotton, what percentage are the exports? As you can see, by 1840, they already represent the majority of exports. So quiz questions won't ask you necessarily the exact percentages of cotton as exports, but you should know that it is a majority. Okay, now turning to the South and not the North, what percentages of the white population owned slaves? Well, about 3 out of 4 did not. So you can see that's the first thing to notice. Does that mean slavery is not a big deal? Because those are the types of things people will bring up in some sort of arguments. Well, and they'll say most people when they are imagining white folk. Most white people didn't own slaves in the South, as if that somehow it diminishes the impact of slavery or something. And, well, they're true, right? So that's what a historian does, is we understand what evidence is fairly accurate, but we don't misrepresent it. Okay, so 3 to 4 did not. As you can see, the bulk of slave owners owned between 1 and 9 slaves. Okay. As you get larger than 10 to 99, there's a significant chunk. And then 100 plus slaves is a very, very small number. By the way, the majority of presidents by 1860 come from that 0.1%. They are large slave owners. Most of the members of the Supreme Court come from that group right there. And we're not even including the North, right? So something to kind of keep in mind, that when we get to the breakup of the Union, those who want to start attacking the interests of slavery, this is why they're doing it. They are saying that the United States has been dominated by a very specific group of people, and that's bad. It's a complicated argument. It's not as straightforward as you think. So hold off on that till we get to disunion. But there is that small group of people. And here's a non-pie chart version of that, right? So if we're looking in 1850 at the numbers of slaves, this is from your book, you can see that, 1 through 4, 1 through 4, 1 through 9, these are small numbers. That's 260,000 slave owners just in that group. And if we go from 10 to 19, is actually one I prefer. I like 1 to 9, 10 to 19, and then 20 to 50, 50 to 100, and then over 100. That's my preferred. But you can see that the number of slaveholders from 1 to 9, that's the biggest group. And when you go from 10 to 19, they're only 1/5 as big as the group ahead of them. And then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So this will help with a pie chart. Just looking at white Southerners who own slaves, again, about half own 1 to 4, about almost 3/4 own 1 to 9, and 16%, 10-19, 9, 20-49, 2%, 50-99, and that famous group 100 plus is about 1 out of 200 slave owners. All right, so we kind of keep this in mind of what slavery looked like. It didn't all look like a large plantation. But definitely the cotton gin is what allows this to happen. Okay, so we're going to kind of zoom through this. The slavery was all present in the South. It was not hidden away only on plantations. It was in the cities. It was in the towns, so on and so forth. Now let's look at a geographic representation of the growth of slavery. My buttons aren't working right now, so hold on. Let's try one more. All right, there we go. So remember from our colonial period, we said that around the Chesapeake, we have the tobacco region, and you have regions that are over 50% slave. And notice how slavery expands greatly over 70 years. And there is this line from South Carolina, there towards the bottom, all the way towards Texas. That is the cotton belt, the black belt that we will be referring to. That's where the growth of slavery occurs more than anywhere else. And you could find this as a historian in the documents all over the place. Here is someone's journal entry of the slave trade moving from the old Virginia area and moving towards Tennessee, where they will produce cotton or maybe hemp. So this large trafficking of slaves towards the West occurred from 1800 to 1860. After 1860, of course, the Civil War will occur, and then when the Civil War is over, by Juneteenth, the slaves will be freed, and that will become a different story. All right, slavery statistics, more statistics. The slave population grew at 6% a year. This is about double the average rate of fecundity, it's called, of Americans, non-native Native Americans in the North and the South. So they are having children and children who survive at higher numbers than the average American. Yes, current research is still ongoing about the process of rape in this population growth, and it is a part of it, definitely. How from 0 to 100 of what role it's playing, historians are working that out now. So large population growth, not slave imports like Cuba, Brazil, and other areas are doing at this time. As you can already see, about 55% by 1860 of slaves produced cotton. Well, that's very significant. It'll be, as you're going to see, much, much higher than anything else. About 10% tobacco. This is a typo. About 10% rice, hemp, and sugar. About 1 in 8 slaves, which is a significant amount, are domestics. They either work in houses in rural locations or in urban locations. And here's the one that probably will surprise you. By 1860, about 1 in 10 slaves, the same amount that produce tobacco, are involved in manufacturing. This involves lumber, iron, and some other goods as well. I know dollar amounts from older days are difficult to swallow, but slaves by 1860 are worth about $500 to $800, and they produce about 5% to 10% of their value, according to the market, per year. Just another map to show you there, the cotton being the largest area from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas. If I didn't say Tennessee, Tennessee. Tobacco still in that Virginia, North Carolina region, but also now in the Ohio River region by Kentucky and Tennessee. Rice along the coast there on the Atlantic Ocean and in Louisiana. Sugar in Louisiana. That area of Florida producing sugar is is very minute. It looks big by geography, but by numbers it's low. And we can even see wheat production, right? So um, this gives us a geographic look at slavery production. Okay, so going back to our first graph of about 75% of white Southerners owning no slaves, uh, that is the most common, social category. Um, and it really was of how many slaves you own from 0 to over 100, one of the main markers of who you are. So we call these yeomen, or plural would be yeomanry. And, most Southerners are doing this. Now, they are related to or working with plantations many of the times. Some of them are, you know, not connected to the slave economy, and others are, even though they don't own slaves. Again, another map just showing you the density of slave populations in large areas of the South. Slaves represent over half the population. So we're going to look at another set of statistics on this. Look on the right at 1860. You can see that Alabama, and Florida, and Georgia, and Louisiana, and Mississippi, and South Carolina, these are areas where that had high numbers of slaves as percentages of their population. You can see Mississippi and South Carolina over half. But you take the South as a whole, it's still about 1/3. So the slave population was pretty significant by 1860. When we look at now we're just looking at the larger plantations. This would be 10 plus, 20 plus, 50 plus, 100 plus, and all vary depending on how big they are. At the top of the structure would certainly be a slave-owning family, a married man and woman usually, if they weren't widowed. The master, the mistress, and the children. And then, depending on how big it was, they would farm out the job of overseeing the plantation to an overseer. And if it was really big, the overseer would, in fact, farm out responsibilities to slaves themselves, a slave gang leader. And so the slave gangs would be organized by a slave who has higher seniority and privilege to be the leader. Also, of course, depending on how big the unit was, there would be slaves dedicated for just activities in the house versus the field slaves. House slaves would be considered a privileged job because your manual labor would be considered by most to be less difficult or preferred as compared to field slaves. There was some problems with the problem being a house slave. Your work was less. One interesting development historians have been able to identify is if you were a house slave on a larger plantation, you also got brought into family politics in a way field slaves were not. So there were some downsides as well. But overall, you would dress better, you would have more food, and your physical exertion as a laborer was lower. But then again, right, you had family politics to deal with. For example, someone want an example, we'll say that a daughter on the plantation of the owning family is Susie. If the mistress of the house says to you as the domestic slave, don't let Susie out of the house or I'm going to get you. You're going to be in big trouble. And then Susie says, hey, I'm leaving the house because I want to go, smooch with some dude down the lane. If you tell mom, I'm going to harm you. You can see how you're brought into this daughter-mother triangle over Susie's actions, and there's no safe way, completely safe way out of that. Well, field slaves wouldn't have to deal with that at all. Definitely, the idea over all this was a paternalist system that used gender and social rank as the best operation of society. So, anyway, something to keep your eye on. Here's a drawing of the overseers there in the middle right, overlooking the slave production. If you've seen the older movies that have slavery in them, like Gone with the Wind, you'll see all of these groups. Now, the owners of slaves or their allies justified slavery in many, many ways. They used Bible. You know, there is slavery in the Bible for sure. They said, see, it's in the Bible. Slavery's okay. They used race theories of white superiority to African inferiority. They also began to articulate that slavery produced a better physical life for slaves than industrialism. Isn't that interesting? So they use kind of a Charles Dickens version of industrialism harming people to say we don't harm our people the way industrialism, so our way is superior. And you see a lot of these around the South to justify slavery. See on the left, there is just beautiful harmony between the slave owners, the families, and the slaves. The slaves are content. They like being part of the system. They're happy. They dance. Of course, not an accurate, not a 100% accurate, mostly inaccurate version of what, if you took a snapshot of what slavery was like on a given day, it wouldn't look like this. Whereas on the right, they contrast that slavery through industrialism is ruining families. Here is a little bit of zooming in to a document. This is a bill of sale of a group of slaves. It's an invoice for 10 Negroes sent to John B. Williams by somebody whose name I can't read right now because it's too small on my computer screen. So you see we have Betsy, Nancy, Harry, and Helen sold as a couple. Mary, Betsy, Isaac, and Fanny sold as a couple. Lucinda, George. And then it's interesting, the invoice includes a variety of expenses on the bill for the person buying them to pay. If you look very closely, it mentions how I did intend to leave Nancy child, but she made such a damned fuss, I had to let her, and I can't read it for, but she gets in on here too. So it kind of shows you the human side of going on as families and individuals are being trafficked. They're both being property as laid out by this document, but they're also people with, emotional bonds to each other. So on this bill of sale for this year, the average cost is about $5.25. The most expensive slaves are about 20 to 30 years old, and by 1850 they cost about $800 if they did not have any physical or behavioral defects, according to the purchasers of people. All right, moving on then past all the numbers, let's look at the life of slaves themselves. So they are born into a slave family. We'll get to that later. And as is age appropriate, according to the slave owners, they begin laboring. Punishments and coercions to work. Right? Why does Dr. Chambers work? Well, he loves his job and he thinks it's a great value for society to teach college history. So there's that. On the other hand, I'm not independently wealthy and can't live by not working the rest of my life. So my coercion for working is also to pay the bills to stay alive. For slaves, they don't have the privileged life I do. So the way that slave owners would push them to work, the most effective, according to now modern historians, is the sale of them or family members, or, of course, more importantly, the threat of sale. That seemed to be very helpful to get people to work. Corporal punishment was less common, but effective. Sexual assault, physical assault, verbal attacks, being reassigned to bad jobs, these are all ways that slaves were compelled to behave and manipulated to work depending on who they are and where they were operating. So physical coercion and whipping was definitely present. The larger the plantation, the more prevalent it would be. Notice, though, I'm going to kind of go a different direction. If we're looking at a small slave owning unit, let's say a farm that owns 3 slaves, whipping wouldn't be that common because the relationship between the slave owner as a small slave owner and a slave on a small slave owned entity would be more personal. And so there would be more personal interaction. You'd probably even eat lunch together. You even talk about, hey, what should we do next? Maybe next week we should fix these fences over there. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, right? So large plantations, medium-sized plantations, and small slave owner farms all have variances of all of this. All right, turning to the lives of slaves themselves, not all slaves lived the same life, but we can look at the aggregate of it and kind of see what's going on. The first thing to know is that the more closer you were to a large plantation, the more likely you lived in slave family quarters and had African American space away from the owner. One little statistic to throw in here that's very important. Hopefully you haven't fallen asleep. You're listening. Even though the largest unit of white folk in the South owned 0 slaves, okay, we're kind of pushing them out of the picture now. And even though the largest group of slave owners owned 1 to 9, we're pushing them out of the picture now. The average slave, so we're reversing those pie graphs. Where did the average slave live? On large plantations. So the average slave owner owned small amounts of slaves. The average slave lived on a large plantation, and as such, lived in slave quarters apart from the slave-owning family. And this is important because it created space and time to develop and then transmit, and then further develop and further transmit a unique African American culture. So it is in the slave family quarters that the most dominant African American culture develops to 1860. And the markers that historians look at to see what's going on are, as you can see, language, music, religion, stories, morality, survival strategies. We'll kind of go through some of these. Language. A different American language, an African American language, which is in English, but uses Africanisms as well, and blends them sometimes, develops and is passed on, right? And you can see this even in modern America. Do you call that, dark carbonated beverage, and we're going to use a cola, is it a soda? Is it a pop? Is it a Coke? Even in modern day, what do you call things? I don't know if you've taken any of these language tests on the internet, but that road on the side of a freeway, or a cricket, or the freeway itself. Do you put the word "the" in front of the number for the 405 in Los Angeles? And all sorts of variations of how we use language, and they develop in different areas for different reasons. By the way, the word "the" in front of the highway number in Los Angeles has a very specific origin. You don't get to know it in this class, but you can email me if you want to know it. That makes sense, but doesn't make sense anywhere else. So language. To give you one example, the word for turtle or various animals will be different. The word for a peanut is goober, for example. Yeah, all sorts of things. All right, music. If you've ever heard an African American spiritual that survived slavery, you might notice that there's a soloist and then a choir behind them. And we call this the call-response pattern. So there is the soloist who gives the call, and then the rest of the choir will respond to it. That has strong African cultural, has a strong African cultural foundation that you're not seeing in non-African portions of American music at this time. Dr. Ann Ostendorf is in our department, and she specializes in music. So if you want to know more on this, go see her. Religion, Christianity, and versions of Christianity, you'll find that The slave populations, again, the larger the plantation, the more likely this happens. They develop their kind of own versions of Christianity. On Sunday, by the way, in the before lunch, they will most likely have to go to attend church at the master's church. They're on the plantation usually, but in the afternoons, they're free to run their own churches on Sunday afternoons. And a lot of slaves reported. By the way, we have their records because during the Great Depression, the U.S. government paid people to go interview former slaves. So we're lucky to have that. They talked about how the religion that they controlled in the afternoon meant more to them and wasn't as boring. Stories, right? We all get handed down stories at the dinner table, would be like the metaphor for that. Like, let me give you one from the Kevin Chambers family. At the Kevin Chambers family dinner table over the years, we sent all sorts of stories to our kids. We told about our past, and and this kind of blends with morality tales and survival strategies. What do you do when this happens? What do you do when that happens? Why is putting your money away instead of borrowing lots of money better? Things like that. So in my family, we at the dinner table and we go, okay, so if you ever get arrested by the police, the first thing you should say is lawyer, right? And then one of the kids said, but Dad, what if I didn't do it? And then Dad said, especially if you haven't done it, right? So that's a survival strategy, a morality, what's right and wrong, being shared in the Chambers family dinner table, right? You may not have been taught that, but I'll see all sorts of people being interviewed, like on I don't know, crime series or something. And the people will be there for 14 hours without a lawyer saying all sorts of stuff. You know, my our family's approach to what's right and wrong is to say lawyer right away. Those are the things that can be handed down. How do you deal with an aggressive overseer? How do you deal with a master who acts this way or that way? What are the best approaches as a slave? This is handed down from generation to generation, and it may be different, right? Um, and so you'll see that in the stories that are handed down, like Brer Rabbit is just one example. The hero of these stories, he does not take on his foes directly and have some sort of hand-to-hand combat like Thor or something like that. But instead, he uses his wits to outsmart his opponents. And that would make sense from a slave's point of view because they have less power in the relationship. So by using your wits to trick your enemies, uh, that would make more sense from their point of view. Whereas when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s in my family, certainly we were not told to trick our way. We were told to be honest every single day, every single moment. Honesty is what is the way forward. So just kind of showing you a little bit of what's going on in the slave family quarters. So ideas, language, music, what's good, what's bad, what's effective, this is all handed down. One part of African American culture you should know, it is represented in film from time to time, is they got to marry each other on their own terms, not as imposed by the owner. And so their cultural marker of being married is to jump over the broomstick together. So I think that's kind of cool. I happen to study Latin America, even the Aztecs, just to give you some different ideas of ways people physically demonstrate they're getting married rather than ring exchange. Um, the upper class Aztecs would the bride and groom they wear about the same thing, which is like a cape over some sort of loincloth, and they would be carried into the room. These are the Aztecs, won't be on the test, but I think it's kind of cute. And they would sit down together, and through the ritual, they would eventually have their capes tied together in a knot. See? So they tied the knot. I think it's kind of cute. All right, back to African Americanisms. Again, a particularly distinct music form evolves over these decades. It has African isms in it. It's not completely African and it's not completely American. It's both. And that is why we use those terms, African American. All right, but certainly the bulk of their day, of their week, was involved in labor, and for the bulk, not all did cotton. This is a picture of cotton, uh, but 7 out of 8 were not domestic slaves, so they could be doing anything that we pointed out on the other slide. All right, resistance. Slaves did resist slavery to an extent. Now, not like a movie where we go to the far right bottom, rebellion, slave rebellion. There are a few slave rebellions from 1800 to 1860, but very few. The most common way was on the left-hand side we call everyday forms of resistance. The way to resist is more passive-aggressive. You slow down your work. You feign illness. You break the tools and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't work. We don't have any tools," right? These are ways to kind of resist the system without getting in trouble. But from time to time, if they felt they needed to do it because the issues, higher stakes were at issue, they might burn down the barn or poison the overseer or flee slavery, right? That's a very risky thing to do. It has a high reward if you're successful, but it also has a high cost if you're not, and most were not successful. And then rebellion has, of course, the highest payout, you know, physical revenge on your owners. But likewise, when it doesn't succeed, and they won't, the cost is very high as well. So, um, Django Unchained, 12 Years a Slave are doing have a much more informed historical background than the previous ones. Just know that by 1860, a number of non-slave owners would gain their income because they operated the slave patrol, which realistically, looking at the South as a whole, was operating by 1860 everywhere. And slaves would need papers to be traveling. The slaves were traveling, just so you know. They're going down the road 10, 20 miles, 30 miles, doing all sorts of stuff. So they weren't stuck on the plantation every single day of the year. But these patrols were ways that the slave owners could control the property and not let it to go away. The very few the very few slave rebellions. One of the biggest ones was in South Carolina. Why should this not surprise you now that you're in my class? Because you know that South Carolina has a very large slave population as a percentage of the country. So it would be more likely to happen there than where the slave population is light. Gabriel's Rebellion, there's one in Louisiana. Of course, Nat Turner's is very important in Virginia in 1831. So there are a few, as you can see, but none of them are successful. They're usually outed before the rebellion gets going sometimes, but other times, like Nat Turner's Rebellion, it's not, and they do carry out violence against the white population, but are eventually overturned. So 1831 is a pretty big year because Nat Turner's Rebellion occurs, and the North starts publishing more than before abolitionist literature, and the British Parliament outlaws slavery. So it's an interesting little tidbit. So this unit has got a lot of information, and this professor lecture has a lot of information, so it's okay if you go back and listen to it a second time. But the outcome of absorbing this information is that you will have an evidence-based, grounded, non-politically manipulated for your current ideas understanding of what was going on with slavery and slaves and their culture and their resistance from 1800 to 1860.